Okay, I read something really stupid this year. Something that I know is trash, something that I went into knowing was trash, but I wanted to read it anyway because I wanted to read something trashy. It was called I Want a Gal Gamer to Praise Me. Now I know what you're thinking. Trooth, why are you reading this trash? Well, isn't it obvious? Who doesn't want a gal gamer to praise them? No, but basically, I don't know, this was just like so stupid, like so stupidly on the nose that it somehow struck a chord with me, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be a really dumb time. I want to read this. And like, part of it is that the main characters in this manga play a game called Bepex, which is very obviously a knockoff on Apex. And I have another colleague at the manga cafe who happens to be a gal gamer who plays Apex all the time, and I cannot stop giving her a hard time as I read this, as I'm basically just like open it up to a page and I'm like, look, it's you. Look, this is you. This is your life. This manga is about you. How does that make you feel? And I don't know. I just find that all incredibly funny. The premise, you know, I mean, do I even need to tell you what the premise is? There's this like shut-in high school boy who wants to get better at playing Bepex, and so he hires one of the top players to coach him in the game, not knowing that one of the top players in the game is actually a babe, and she comes to his house to train him. They don't just go over training online. She actually comes to his house in person and hangs out with him, and actually she's really happy that somebody actually wants to play video games with her and spend time with her. And I'm just like, it's everything you expect it to be. It's exactly what you expect. It's so much stupid stuff where, like, you know, she's leaning over the back of his computer chair watching him play, and it's like, oh, are her boobs gonna accidentally touch his shoulder? Oh my gosh. And you know, and there's another page where it's like, oh, she passed the controller to him, but somehow the controller's cord was like so elaborately wrapped around her as she was getting into the game that her handing him the controller accidentally made the cord lift her skirt up and he saw her underwear. What? Can you believe it? And I'm just like, it's so stupid. I don't know if I'm gonna read more of that. Sometimes you just have to willingly read something that you know is trash so that everything else you read looks better by comparison. Although, near the end of the first volume, a second character gets introduced, who is the tomboy childhood friend retro gamer character, and maybe now I'm not reading this manga ironically anymore. I read volume 1 of a new manga called Whoever Steals This Book. I've mentioned this with a couple more titles that I've talked about in this recap, where this was one where I was looking through the upcoming releases of publishers, and this was an eye-catching title for a new series. As it turns out, Whoever Steals This Book is a manga adaptation of a novel, maybe a light novel, I'm not sure exactly. Volume 2 has come out and I have not read it. Honestly, this one is probably a drop for me. But I don't know. Volume 1, I remember it being alright, but you know, it was only like a couple months ago that I read it and I don't remember that much about it. The main character is this high school girl who hates books, and her family is known for owning this like huge collection of books that like her whole town is famous for, and her whole town is now famous for books. But she doesn't like all the attention that it has brought to her and her family. And essentially it's like one day this, I don't know, mysterious like fox spirit shows up and like curses a bunch of the books in her family's collection, and it ends up that like this girl has to like travel into the story worlds of various books and find something that's amiss and like hunt down this mischievous spirit and like find the discrepancy that saves the story, that kind of thing. And she's being guided by another like white-haired mysterious fox spirit girl. I don't know, like I said, I'm kind of fuzzy on the details already. Overall, you know, like, it was an eye-catching manga, and I did like the premise of it. I don't think it's a terrible manga. I think, you know, I would like other people to read it and buy it. I'm sure, you know, it's right for somebody, but I don't think it's right for me. A big thing that put me off from it is I think that it's an awkward adaptation. You know, I tend to lean away from manga that are adaptations of other things. Like, I'll rarely read a manga that's an adaptation of a light novel if I can help it. I almost never will read a manga that is an adaptation of an original anime. And that is kind of the same case with whoever steals this book. It's an awkward adaptation. I can exemplify that within, like, the first, like, 3 pages of the manga. I was already thinking about dropping it because it was just, like, walls and walls of text. There was, like, a disproportionate amount of expository text right at the very beginning of it, disproportionate to the illustrations. And, you know, the whole point of a manga adaptation versus the original novel is the addition of illustrations. And so if you're gonna let exposition take the priority over your illustrations of the story, then I feel like you have not done the best job of adapting the material into this other medium. Sometimes the material just doesn't adapt well. Sometimes not a lot is going on. Sometimes there's not a lot to illustrate. That's not necessarily a problem of the artist, you know, it could just be an inherent issue of the source material that you can't really adapt it without losing something. In kind of a tangent, I've always kind of felt this way about Steins Gate. So I have not, you know, played through any of the Steins Gate visual novels or anything like that. I've only seen the anime. And I became aware watching and rewatching Steins Gate, because, you know, I have seen it like 2 or 3 times. It does kind of play like a visual novel adaptation, because a great number of scenes in that anime are just characters sitting around in a room and talking, which, you know, is kind of the main mode of story conveyance in a visual novel, is you are in a scene and characters go through a bunch of dialogue. There's not a lot of, like, action going on, but, you know, that's just inherent to the visual novel medium. And so when they adapted that into an anime, it's not like they could add a bunch of action scenes to supplement all the dialogue. They just kinda had to animate scenes of people standing around in a room and talking. And, you know, it kinda gets a pass because it's still a very compelling story despite that. But once you're aware that it comes from a visual novel, it's kind of hard to not see those roots. And that's kind of the same way I feel about whoever steals this book. I read volume 1 of My Dear Friend Nokotan. Basically, I saw a trailer come out for this series, which is being animated, I think, by Wit Studio. The anime will probably have premiered by the time this video is out. I saw the trailer for it, and I was just like, wow, I don't think there was a single thing that happened in that trailer that I could have predicted. I absolutely have to steal the description that was put out by a member of my Discord, Crow Kid, who is one of the most active members there, and somebody who is always a lot of fun. I posted that trailer in my Discord, and he almost immediately goes, Nichijou ran so that this series could shit its pants at the starting gun. Anyway, yeah, I read volume 1, and I think, like, maybe 5-ish volumes are out in English currently. I don't know if I'm gonna read more, because I'm like, I don't know, it's pretty funny, but I might just watch the anime, because this might be one of those situations where the animation studio kind of torques up the zaniness of it and makes it like even more fun to watch. I don't know. But that description, I feel like, pretty well does it justice. It is just like a zany high school comedy manga where it's about, you know, this main girl who tries to be like the perfect student in every way, but secretly she had a past life as a juvenile delinquent. And one day this new transfer student shows up who is a deer girl and has antlers, and she seems to be the only person who can see through this girl's facade. And she's also a gigantic idiot, and all of the characters are gigantic idiots. And so, you know, it's a lot of very classical Japanese comedy duo stuff where the main girl is constantly playing straight man to the deer girl and pointing out how all of the zany things she does are so zany and she needs to get it under control already. Based on what I've read out of Volume 1, there's not a lot much more to it than that. It's just a lot of silly gags after silly gags, but I mean, I will probably be watching this first season. There's not really anything else in the summer anime season that I'm looking forward to watching, so I'm probably just going to be watching that and revisiting some older things. So it's like, you know, pretty middle of the road. You know, I read it and I enjoyed it pretty well. Maybe I'll read more, maybe I won't. It's kind of like right on the edge there. Now, one of the most recent things I finished reading was probably the oldest published manga in the Manga Cafe. I decided to read the first book of Astro Boy. And when I say the first book, I mean the first, like, 700-ish page omnibus that is published by Dark Horse. The thing that's kind of cool about this book is it lets you know when each story arc was originally published. Because, like, it's definitely not a chronological compilation. So, like, sometimes a chapter in this book is, like, 20 pages long. Sometimes a story in it is, like, 200 pages long. But, you know, the only Tezuka manga that I had read before this was Apollo's Song, which I just kind of read on impulse because I saw it on the shelf in the Manga Cafe. I had never heard anybody else talk about it or recommend it to me, and, you know, I just kind of read it on a whim, and, you know, obviously I liked it. His reputation precedes him. I feel like I owe it to myself to read a little bit of Astro Boy. Like, if I want to be a self-proclaimed manga expert, then, you know, I've got to read one of the, like, foundational works of manga. I think I was reluctant for a long time because, like, a lot of the older manga that I've read, it kind of involves a lot of just, like, really campy and silly looking art and, like, stylistic choices compared to modern standards. But, you know, I once again am disappointed in myself for doubting Tezuka. Because, you know, he has this colossal reputation, and obviously that comes from somewhere. And Astro Boy was a very pleasant surprise. I thought it would be, you know, just kind of a childish superhero action story, but it really was a lot more than that. Like, almost every story actually was kind of a compelling sci-fi speculative premise about the nature of, like, robotics and cybernetics. It was all, like, you know, a lot more than super-powered robot fights evil robots to save people. Like, one of the memorable early stories in this book was about these people who have made cyborgs using the brains of dogs, and they've put them into, like, cybernetically enhanced humanoid bodies. And they used dog brains because it was deemed unethical to do the same with humans. So they've given them, you know, like, self-awareness and a human-like intelligence, but, like, it becomes this really interesting situation where they have these kind of, like, latent canine instincts, and they don't feel at home in their like humanoid cyborg bodies, but they also don't understand this longing they have for, you know, so many canine instincts. And one of the main characters, you know, one of the main like dog cyborg soldiers, happened to be the pet of another character, and so it's like his canine instincts are driving him back to his original master's home, and like he wants to go back to where he lived with this human, but doesn't understand why he has these instincts driving him to do that. And I did not expect such a thoughtful sci-fi premise as like inhuman minds being transplanted into humanoid cyborg bodies and the like ethical repercussions of that action. An important thing to keep in mind is that Astro Boy was being published like a very short time after Isaac Asimov had made I, Robot, one of the foundational stories about robotics in science fiction, and kind of, you know, set the baseline for a lot of what we think of as robotics in sci-fi today, or even robotics in the real world. And Astro Boy deals with a surprising amount of similar level speculative sci-fi. One of the plot lines is even about a robot being elected as the leader of a country, which I think was also a story in the original book I, Robot. And I don't know if Tezuka read that book and was inspired to make something similar, or if it's just like one of those unusual coincidences where two people in two very different parts of the world happened to write very similar stories. But then I got to the arc of the strongest robot on Earth, which, for anybody unfamiliar, would later become the basis for the manga Pluto, which was done by Naoki Urasawa, who is also very well known for making Monster and 20th Century Boys. I have yet to read Pluto or watch the anime adaptation that came out last year, but those are definitely going to be on my radar. Now, the original Greatest Robot on Earth plotline was, well, it was one of the most popular stories in Astro Boy from what I have read. Obviously, I wasn't alive at the time, but I understand it to be one of the most popular arcs. And I can see why that is, because as I was reading this arc, it seemed to have been the basis for so many tropes of shonen action manga that came in the decades after. It has so many, like, well-loved story elements. Like, it sets up, okay, here's all of the 7 most powerful robots in the world, and the new evil robot Pluto has set out to defeat them all in combat. And so it sets up all of these 7 unique robots with all of their unique powers, and Astro Boy, of course, happens to be one of them. Which, by the way, speaking of, throughout several of the stories in this first volume, there are a bunch of times where characters say that Astro Boy is known for having 7 special powers. And at no point in any of the stories I read did they detail what those 7 powers are. So I might need to read some more of Astro Boy and kind of figure that out. But anyway, you even see the introduction of concepts like power levels in this Astro Boy story. It's stated that Astro Boy has 100,000 horsepower. He's a 100,000 horsepower robot. But then, Pluto is built, and he's a 1 million horsepower robot. So obviously his power level is too high for Astro Boy to ever have the hopes of beating him. But, you know, in true Tezuka fashion, when Astro Boy goes to Professor Ochanomizu and says to him, "You need to upgrade me into a 1 million horsepower robot so I can defeat Pluto," the professor is saying to him, "No, I refuse to do something like that for you. You're not designed to hold that kind of power." and you don't need a higher power level to do good for the world. You know, it's about, you know, your deeds and your behavior are what make up the good you can do, rather than just how powerful you can be to fight other robots. But spoilers, I guess, for this like 70-year-old story, there does come a point later on where Astro Boy gets that 1 million horsepower upgrade, and then we see what looks like the original Super Saiyan transformation. Because he gets this power upgrade, and his hair starts glowing gold, and he's just like overcome with so much power that he can barely contain. And I was like, man, this is straight up Goku. This is straight up DBZ power levels. And it's so cool to like go back and see something that you know had to have directly inspired Akira Toriyama. In addition to, you know, dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of other artists all over the world since then. So there is a good chance I'll be reading more of Astro Boy. Now, there were definitely some things that were hard to come to grips with. Like, the only way you can buy Astro Boy in the United States is to buy a mirrored version of the manga. So, you know, it was made to read left to right. They mirrored all of the artwork so that it would read that way. Which, you know, it's whatever. Most of the time, that's not a big deal, although there were 1 or 2 times where some of the original Japanese text was still left in a panel, like, you know, as background art, or like in a newspaper or something. And I was like, oh, yeah, I can see how they mirrored that, because there's just some straight up backwards Japanese text there. Another weird thing, though, is like, the omnibus compilation gives you like introductions to some of the stories and kind of, you know, tells you here's what you're in for these stories, and here's how the times were different back then. And like, Tezuka had this practice in Astro Boy and even some of his other manga of just like throwing in random cartoon characters who just pop into a panel, say a non sequitur line, and are gone. And this is like, I guess, like non-diegetic too. Like, none of the other characters address this character suddenly popping up, and I don't understand why these characters pop in and just say some nonsense and then leave, other than it's just something that Tezuka thought was silly that would entertain the children. I can't explain why I might have had doubts about Astro Boy, or like why I thought it would be an uninteresting read, because the reputation really does speak for itself, and it really was fascinating to read, not just because the stories themselves were so interesting, but, you know, it's also that interesting, like, cultural window that you're looking into. You know, you're looking into another time period in another part of the world, but also seeing how influential it was. It just kind of speaks for itself how much this influenced so many other works that came after it. And so, you know, my worry was that, you know, this would be something so antiquated that I wouldn't be able to relate to it. But in fact, I think it being antiquated made it a more compelling read for me, because, you know, this wasn't just like something that people of the time read and were done with and threw away, but it is something that endured, echoing through so much of modern culture. And reading it, you know, I could totally see why. But anyway, I don't mean to gush too much about it, but, you know, if you also are a manga enthusiast and you've never read any of Astro Boy, then, you know, definitely do check it out. You are probably underestimating it like I did. Sooner or later, I might end up reading the whole series. Well, thanks for making it to the end of yet another installment of my Summer of Manga recap. Special thanks to the financial supporters of the Manga Cafe listed here. For our audience question this time, Cam asks, "Do you still making reviews?" And, well, to answer that, it has kind of been a long time since I did like a full-on proper review of anything, you know, whether it be manga or anime or video games or much of anything. But I do want to get back to it once I get done with the summer recap, which is only going to be one more episode after this one. It's coming very soon. Then I'd like to start work on something a little more involved. But you'll get a hint about that in the next video, so stay tuned for that. And if you would like an audience question answered, you can leave a message on this video, or you can hit me up on Twitter, or join my Discord, or whatever. Somebody, please respond. Anyway, thanks again for watching. See you next time.